Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 3 of our complete practice question series for the AZ-305 Microsoft Certified Solutions Architect Expert exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends. Then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 3. Let us focus on question number 92. This question focuses on identity governance. This scenario establishes the key requirement. Contract engineers have Azure RBAC access to resources supporting a custom application. Their manager must receive a monthly review, and unconfirmed assignments must be removed automatically with minimal custom code. Which solution should be recommended? Focus on the distinction between these options. Now examine choice A, a Microsoft intra-access review for the relevant resource role assignments. Now examine choice B, a runbook that enumerates role assignments and emails a spreadsheet. Now examine choice C, a permanent PIM active assignment. Now examine choice D, a runbook that lists enterprise application role grants. The required response is option A, a Microsoft intra-access review for the relevant resource role assignments. This is correct because access reviews can run on a schedule, request manager decisions, apply results automatically, and remove denied or unreviewed access. The alternatives can be eliminated because B, a custom runbook requires development and separate remediation logic. C, a permanent PIM assignment does not perform recurring entitlement validation. D, application role grants are different from the Azure RBAC assignments described. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use access reviews for recurring attestation and automatic removal. Use PIM for just-in-time privileged activation. The next item is question number 93. Scenario. A finance team needs temporary read access to a blob container from April 1st through April 30th. Access must expire automatically without rotating the storage account keys. Which mechanism should be included? Available choices. Option A, a time-limited user delegation shared access signature. Option B, a storage account access key. Option C, a client certificate stored on every workstation. Option D, a conditional access policy without a storage authorization grant. The correct answer is option A, time-limited user delegation shared access signature. The key reason is ASAS can grant narrowly scoped blob permissions with explicit start and expiry times, avoiding disclosure of the account key. In a user delegation, SAS leverages intra-ID for improved security. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because B, an account key grants broad, long-lived access and does not automatically expire. C, a certificate alone does not grant blob data plane permissions. D, conditional access can add identity controls but does not replace a blob authorization mechanism. A useful examination rule is this. Prefer a user delegation SAS for blob access when Microsoft intra-authorization is available. Question number 94. Requires careful analysis. Treat this as a medium question. Identify the decisive requirement in this scenario. An internal claims application runs on-premises and uses integrated Windows authentication. Remote employees have no VPN connectivity but need Microsoft intra pre-authentication and single sign-on. Which two components should the design include? Select 2. More than one answer may be correct. Eliminate any option that fails a requirement. Consider option A, Microsoft Intra-Application Proxy. Consider option B, Azure Application Gateway. Consider option C, a Microsoft Intra-Enterprise Application. Consider option D, Azure Arc. Consider option E, Privileged Identity Management. Consider option F, Azure Policy. The choices that satisfy the requirement are option A, Microsoft Intra-Application Proxy, and option C, a Microsoft Intra-Enterprise Application. The requirement is satisfied because Application Proxy securely publishes the on-premises app, while the corresponding enterprise application defines access, pre-authentication, and SSO settings. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B, Application Gateway is an Azure regional reverse proxy and does not provide intra-IWA delegation by itself. D, Azure Arc manages external resources but does not publish web apps. EPIM governs privileged roles, not application SSO. F. Azure policy enforces resource compliance, not user authentication. Keep this examination point in mind. Use application proxy plus an enterprise application for VPN-less access to supported on-premises web apps. Now consider question number 95. Review the situation. A collaboration group contains employees and external guests. Every member must attest quarterly that access is still needed. A denial or no response must automatically remove the member. Which capability should be configured? Review the options. Choice A, Microsoft Intra-Identity Protection. Choice B, a dynamic membership rule. Choice C, a recurring access review. Choice D, privileged identity management. The best answer is option C, a recurring access review. The reasoning is as follows. A recurring access review lets members attest, supports quarterly scheduling, and can automatically remove denied or non-responsive users when results are applied. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Identity protection evaluates sign-in and user risk. B. Dynamic groups evaluate user attributes, not periodic attestations. DPIM manages privileged activation and eligibility rather than ordinary group membership reviews. Exam tip. Access reviews validate ongoing entitlement. Dynamic groups calculate membership from attributes. Review question number 96. Carefully. This question moves us into hybrid identity. Let us first review the situation. An on-premises ASP.NET application must be published to Internet users without a VPN. Users must authenticate with Microsoft Entra ID, and multi-factor authentication must be enforced before access. Arrange the 3 design activities in the recommended sequence. The available items are: Entry 1. Create a conditional access policy that requires multi-factor authentication for the application. Entry 2. Publish the on-premises application through Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. Entry 3. Configure the generated Microsoft Entra Enterprise application and assign the permitted users. The completed sequence is: the first item is publish the on-premises application through Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. The second item is configure the generated Microsoft Entra Enterprise application and assign the permitted users. The third item is create a conditional access policy that requires multi-factor authentication for the application. Here is the technical justification. Publishing creates the cloud application object, an external route. The enterprise application is then configured for assignments and SSO, after which conditional access can target it and enforce MFA. Application proxy publishes on-premises web apps. Conditional access protects the resulting enterprise application. Question number 97 highlights an important distinction. Focus on the following situation. An auditor needs to identify every Azure Resource Manager deployment performed in a subscription during the preceding month. Which Azure data source directly records those control plane operations? The relevant choices are as follows. Option A, Azure Monitor Action Groups. Option B, Azure Activity Log. Option C, Azure Advisor. Option D, Azure Analysis Services. The appropriate choice is option B, Azure Activity Log. Azure Activity Log records subscription-level control plane events, including deployment operations and resource changes. The remaining options are incorrect because A, action groups deliver notifications and invoke actions. C, advisor produces optimization recommendations. D, analysis services provides analytical semantic models. The key takeaway is use activity log for who did what control plane events. Export it when longer retention or advanced querying is required. Proceed to question number 98. A branch file server holds 600 gigabytes of documents that must be copied into Azure Blob Storage. The architect needs 2 supported alternatives, one offline and one network-based managed transfer. Which 2 services can complete the transfer? Select 2. Identify all valid responses. The options are: Option A, Azure Import Export. Option B, Azure Batch. Option C, Azure Data Factory with a self-hosted integration runtime. Option D, an analysis services on-premises data gateway. Option E, a Logic Apps integration account. The correct answers are option A, Azure Import, Export, and option C, Azure Data Factory with a self-hosted integration runtime. This is correct because Import, Export supports offline disk-based ingestion to Azure storage, while Data Factory can copy on-premises files through a self-hosted integration runtime. B, Batch schedules compute-intensive jobs, but is not a managed file migration service. D, the Analysis Services Gateway connects BI models to data sources and does not copy files into blob storage. E, an integration account stores B2B artifacts for logic apps. Remember this distinction for the exam. Choose Data Factory for online managed copy and Import, Export, or Databox for offline transfer constraints. Question number 99. We are moving to hybrid identity. Consider this scenario. A Linux application is being rehosted on an Azure VM. It performs LDAP binds against an on-premises ADDS domain whose identities already synchronize to Microsoft Entra ID. Policy prohibits the Azure workload from connecting back to the data center. Which identity service should support the application after migration? Choice A, Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. Choice B, an Azure VPN Gateway. Choice C, Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Choice D, a self-managed ADDS domain controller on one VM. In this case, select option C, Microsoft Entra Domain Services. The key reason is Microsoft Entra Domain Services provides managed LDAP, Kerberos, NTLM, and domain join capabilities in Azure using synchronized identities, without requiring the workload to reach on-premises ADDS. The alternatives can be eliminated because A, Application Proxy publishes web applications and does not provide LDAP directory services to the VM. B, a VPN would violate the no connectivity policy. D, a single self-managed domain controller adds operational overhead and is not resilient. A useful examination rule is this. Use Microsoft Entra Domain Services when a lifted legacy workload still requires LDAP or traditional domain protocols. Let us work through question number 100. Consider the following scenario. A regional office hosts a Windows file server used by employees worldwide. The organization wants a cloud-based authoritative copy so users can continue accessing the share rapidly when that office is offline. Which solution should be recommended? Choose from the following options. Option A is a recovery services vault with Windows Server Backup. Option B is blob containers with Azure File Sync. Option C is an Azure File Share with Azure File Sync. Option D is a recovery services vault with Azure Backup only. The appropriate choice is option C, an Azure File Share with Azure File Sync. The requirement is satisfied because Azure File Sync centralizes the namespace in Azure Files and synchronizes the branch server, allowing clients or another server endpoint to use the cloud-backed data when the original server is unavailable. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because a Windows Server Backup to a vault is not the Azure File Sync continuity architecture. B, Azure File Sync uses Azure File Shares, not blob containers, as the cloud endpoint. D, Backup provides recovery points, but not an immediately accessible SMB share. Keep this examination point in mind. Azure File Sync is for active file server synchronization. Azure Backup is for recovery points. We will now analyze question number 101. Next, we enter the topic of data analytics design. Review the scenario carefully. A legacy Azure Databricks workload mounts ADLS Generation 2 through DBFS. Folder ACLs are assigned directly to individual engineers, and the temporary design must preserve each user's storage identity with the least change and lowest eligible workspace tier. Complete the legacy compatibility recommendation. Review Statement 1. Use the Databricks the blank workspace tier. The options for this statement are standard or premium. Review Statement 2. Configure the blank on the cluster so ADLS evaluates each engineer's identity. The options for this statement are credential pass-through, a workspace secret scope, or MLflow. The answer to the first statement is premium. Credential pass-through requires the premium tier in the legacy architecture. The answer to the second statement is credential pass-through. It forwards the signed-in user's Microsoft Entra identity so ADLS, ACLs can enforce folder-level access. Exam tip: DBFS mounts and credential pass-through are legacy patterns. Current guidance favors Unity Catalog with an Azure Databricks Access Connector or Managed Identity. The transformed item explicitly scopes the answer to temporary legacy compatibility. Let us examine question number 102. Begin by examining the scenario. A regulated Azure SQL database must retain restorable backups for 7 years. Which feature should the architect configure? Now examine the possible answers. Choice A, active georeplication. Choice B, Azure Site Recovery. Choice C, a long-term retention policy. Choice D, default short-term automated backups only. The required response is option C, a long-term retention policy. The reasoning is as follows. Long-term retention copies selected full backups to durable storage for retention periods measured in years. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Georeplication supports availability and read scale, not compliance backup retention. B. Site recovery protects supported machines, not Azure SQL database backup history. D. Default short-term retention does not meet a 7-year requirement. Use long-term retention for multi-year Azure SQL compliance backups. The next key item is question number 103. The central scenario is as follows. An operations team needs a deterministic, point-in-time test showing whether an NSG permits or denies a specific 5-tuple flow to an Azure VM. Would a traffic analytics dashboard alone meet this requirement? The relevant choices are as follows. Now examine choice A. Yes. Now examine choice B. No. The correct answer is option B. No. Here is the technical justification. Traffic analytics summarizes collected flow log data. It is not the deterministic configuration test for a specific proposed packet. IP Flow Verify is designed to return allowed or denied in the matching rule. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. A dashboard may show historical traffic, but does not replace an explicit reachability and rule evaluation test. The key takeaway is use IP Flow Verify for a specific allow or deny decision. Use traffic analytics for aggregated traffic insights. Now consider question number 104. Review the situation. A support engineer must determine whether an NSG rule allows or denies a proposed connection to an Azure virtual machine. Does Azure Advisor directly perform this packet flow rule evaluation? The options are option A, yes. Option B, no. The best answer is option B, no. Azure Advisor provides cost, reliability, security, performance, and operational recommendations. It does not evaluate a specific packet against effective NSG rules. The remaining options are incorrect because A. The correct diagnostic capability is Network Watcher IP Flow Verify, not Advisor. Remember this distinction for the exam. Advisor recommends improvements. Network Watcher diagnoses network paths and security rule decisions. Question number 105. Scenario. A cloud engineer supplies a VM network interface, protocol, local and remote addresses, and ports. The engineer must learn whether Azure networking permits the flow and which NSG rule is responsible. Does Network Watcher IP Flow Verify meet the requirement? Available choices. Choice A, no. Choice B, yes. In this case, select option B. Yes. This is correct because IP Flow Verify evaluates the specified flow against effective NSG rules and returns whether access is allowed or denied, including the responsible rule. A. No other service is required for this specific NSG decision test. A useful examination rule is this. Use IP Flow Verify for a 5-tuple NSG decision. Use Connection Troubleshoot for end-to-end reachability. Let us examine question number 106. The focus now shifts to logging architecture. Begin by examining the scenario. Windows and Linux Azure virtual machines send operating system security events to a log analytics workspace through Azure Monitor Agent. Match each operating system log source to the table queried in Azure Monitor Logs. The items to be placed are: Source 1, Windows Event Log Records. Source 2, Linux System Logging Records. The target positions are: Target A, syslog. Target B, Azure Activity. Target C, Event. Target D, Azure Diagnostics. The first mapping connects Windows Event Log Records to Event. The second mapping connects Linux System Logging Records to syslog. The key reason is Windows Event Log data is stored in the event table for this collection path, while Linux syslog messages are stored in the syslog table. Keep this examination point in mind. Azure Activity is for subscription control plane events. Azure Diagnostics stores supported resource logs. We will now analyze question number 107. Review the scenario carefully. A globally distributed content service needs SQL-like queries over JSON documents, writable replicas in several regions, and consistently low read latency near users. Which database service should be recommended? Compare the following options. Option A is Azure SQL Database with active georeplication. Option B is Azure Database for PostgreSQL. Option C is Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Option D is Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. The required response is Option C, Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. The requirement is satisfied because Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL supports SQL-style queries, multi-region writes, tunable consistency, and globally distributed low-latency reads. The alternatives can be eliminated because A, active georeplication normally uses one writable primary rather than multi-master writes. B, PostgreSQL does not provide the same turnkey global multi-write architecture. D, hyperscale scales storage and compute, but is not a globally distributed multi-master document database. Exam tip. Cosmos DB for NoSQL is the Azure choice when global multi-write and low-latency document access are decisive. Review question number 108. Carefully. The focus now shifts to virtual machine design. Let us first review the situation. A legacy Windows web application depends on a host-installed COM component and cannot run on app service. An existing global DNS routing layer will direct users to healthy regions. The compute design must survive a complete regional outage and minimize operational cost. Which regional deployment pattern should be added? Review each available choice. Choice A, one VM scale set distributed across two availability zones in one region. Choice B, a web app in each of two regions behind regional load balancers. Choice C, a VM scale set and regional load balancer in each of two regions. Choice D, a web app in each of two regions with no regional load balancer. The appropriate choice is option C, a VM scale set and regional load balancer in each of two regions. The reasoning is as follows. VM scale sets provide the required operating system control for the COM dependency, and deploying them in two regions provides regional failure resilience. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A, availability zones protect against data center failure, but not an entire region outage. B, app service does not provide the required host-level COM installation control. D, it has the same app service compatibility problem and lacks a defined regional ingress pattern. Host-installed dependencies usually require virtual machines. Regional resilience requires separate regional deployments plus global routing. The next item is question number 109. On-premises transaction processing applications will access Azure SMB shares. The design must use the lowest latency Azure Files tier and the strongest supported in-region resiliency available for that tier in a supported region. Complete the recommendation. The first statement reads, select the blank Azure Files tier. Select from Premium, Transaction Optimized, or Hot. The second statement reads, configure the blank redundancy. Select from LRS, ZRS, or GRS. For Statement 1, select Premium. Premium Azure Files uses SSD-backed storage for transaction-intensive, latency-sensitive workloads. For Statement 2, select ZRS. ZRS distributes the file share data across availability zones and provides greater in-region resilience than LRS where supported. The key takeaway is premium file share redundancy availability varies by region and account configuration. The source visual did not state a region, so ZRS support must be verified. Let us work through question number 110. Consider the following scenario. A stateless full .NET Framework application requires administrator access to Windows, custom host dependencies, and continuity after a complete Azure region failure. Does deploying one auto-scaling VM scale set in a single region satisfy all requirements? Compare the following options. Choice A, yes. Choice B, no. The best answer is option B, no. Here is the technical justification. A VM scale set supplies OS access and auto-scaling, but a single region deployment does not remain available after that region fails. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Regional resilience requires a second regional deployment and a global routing or failover layer. Remember this distinction for the exam. Auto-scaling is not disaster recovery. Explicitly design a second region when regional failure is in scope. Proceed to question number 111. We are moving to global routing. Consider this scenario. A Windows web workload runs on one VM in each of two Azure regions. Administrators need OS access, and users must fail over between regions. Does placing both regional virtual machines behind one Azure application gateway meet the regional failover requirement? Review the options. Option A, yes. Option B, no. The correct answer is option B, no. Application gateway is a regional service. A single gateway cannot provide the required global routing and failover across independent regional deployments. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Use a global service such as Azure Front Door or Traffic Manager above regional endpoints. A useful examination rule is this. Application gateway is regional layer 7 load balancing. Front Door and Traffic Manager provide global routing. Let us work through question number 112. Let us first review the situation. A legacy full .NET application runs on one administrator-managed Windows VM in each of two Azure regions. DNS-based failover is acceptable. Does an Azure Traffic Manager profile targeting the two regional endpoints meet the regional resilience requirement? Choose from the following options. Option A is no. Option B is yes. In this case, select option B. Yes. This is correct because Traffic Manager can health probe the regional endpoints and direct DNS clients to the healthy region, while the virtual machines provide full OS control. The remaining options are incorrect because A. The architecture satisfies the stated DNS-based cross-region failover requirement, assuming each endpoint is configured and monitored correctly. Keep this examination point in mind. Traffic Manager provides DNS-based global failover. Azure Front Door provides proxy-based Layer 7 global routing. Review question number 113. Carefully. Consider the following scenario. An organization has a basic Azure Virtual WAN with hubs in two regions. It must connect an ExpressRoute circuit to a virtual hub. What must be done first? Now examine the possible answers. Choice A. Create a virtual network that acts as a hub. Choice B. Enable ExpressRoute Premium on the circuit. Choice C. Upgrade Virtual WAN to standard. Choice D. Create an ExpressRoute gateway in the existing basic hub. The required response is option C. Upgrade Virtual WAN to standard. The key reason is ExpressRoute connectivity and gateways in Virtual WAN require the standard Virtual WAN type. A. Virtual WAN uses managed virtual hubs and does not require a customer hub VNet for this task. B. ExpressRoute Premium is used for expanded route limits and global connectivity, not to enable virtual WAN support. D. The gateway cannot be created for this purpose until the virtual WAN is standard. Exam tip. Basic virtual WAN supports limited site-to-site VPN scenarios. Use standard for ExpressRoute and advanced hub connectivity. Proceed to question number 114. This question moves us into migration strategy. A company will migrate an on-premises SQL database by backing it up to an Azure Blob container, move shared website assets to an Azure storage account, and send database performance metrics directly to Azure Monitor. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. The first statement is, a customer-managed Azure storage account is required for the database migration method. The second statement is, a customer-managed Azure storage account is required for the shared website content. The third statement is, a customer-managed Azure storage account is required to collect the database metrics in Azure Monitor. The answer to statement 1 is yes. The selected backup to URL migration method needs a blob container. The answer to statement 2 is yes. The shared content is explicitly being moved to Azure Storage. The answer to statement 3 is no. Azure Monitor can collect and retain the specified metrics without a separate customer-managed storage account. Determine storage account requirements from the selected migration and observability architecture, not from the word migration alone. Let us examine question number 115. Begin by examining the scenario. An order system publishes shipping events. Several independent downstream applications must each receive selected events based on message properties, and adding a new consumer must not change the publisher. Which messaging entity should replace the current storage queue? Review each available choice. Option A is one service bus queue. Option B is one service bus topic with subscriptions. Option C is several independent storage queues managed by the publisher. Option D is one data factory pipeline. The best answer is option B, one service bus topic with subscriptions. The requirement is satisfied because a service bus topic provides publish-subscribe delivery, and subscriptions can use filters so each consumer receives the events relevant to it. The alternatives can be eliminated because a queue uses competing consumers, so each message is normally processed by only one receiver. C. Publisher-managed duplicate queues increase coupling and administrative effort. D. Data Factory is a data integration service, not the durable transactional broker requested. The key takeaway is use a queue for one logical receiver and a topic with filtered subscriptions for multiple independent receivers. We will now analyze question number 116. Next, we enter the topic of logging architecture. Review the scenario carefully. Two Azure SQL logical servers exist, SQL East in East US and SQL West in West US. A storage v2 account named Audit East is in East US, while a blob storage account named Audit Central is in Central US. Assume the auditing design requires the storage destination to be in the same region as the logical server. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. A database on SQL East can write audit records to Audit East. Statement 2. A second database on SQL East can write audit records to Audit Central. Statement 3. A database on SQL West can write audit records to Audit Central. For the first statement, choose yes. The logical server and storage account are both in East US. For the second statement, choose no. The storage account is in Central US, not East US. For the third statement, choose no. The storage account is in Central US, not West US. Remember this distinction for the exam. Validate destination type, region, network rules, and authorization when designing Azure SQL auditing to storage. Let us focus on question number 117. Focus on the following situation. An Azure VM backup policy runs daily at 1800 hours universal time coordinated. It retains daily points for 90 days, weekly points for 26 weeks, monthly points for 36 months, and no yearly points. Complete the recovery statements. For the first statement, the longest configured recovery point retention is the blank. The available choices are 90 days, 26 weeks, 36 months, or 45 months. For the second statement, the minimum scheduled recovery point objective is the blank. The available choices are 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, or 1 month. Statement 1 should be completed with 36 months. Monthly recovery points are retained longer than the daily and weekly points. Statement 2 should be completed with 1 day. A daily backup schedule creates one scheduled recovery point every day. A useful examination rule is this. The source depends on an OCR extracted exhibit. Although the key values are readable, the policy image should be compared with the original screenshot. The next item is question number 118. Scenario. Event Grid will trigger custom C# processing that must connect to ASQL Server VM through its private IP address. The workload is intermittent, and the selected hosting plan must support virtual network integration at the lowest cost among the listed choices. Which compute option should be recommended? Choice A, Logic Apps Consumption. Choice B, Functions Premium. Choice C, Functions Consumption. Choice D, Logic Apps Integrated Service Environment. The appropriate choice is option B, Functions Premium. The reasoning is as follows. Functions Premium supports custom C# event handlers and virtual network integration for reaching private IP resources while avoiding the much higher fixed cost of a dedicated integration service environment. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A, the multi-tenant Logic Apps Consumption option does not provide the required custom C# execution and private network pattern as stated. C, the legacy consumption option in the source does not provide the required VNet integration capability. D, an integration service environment can provide network isolation but is retired/legacy and significantly more expensive. Keep this examination point in mind. Choose a functions plan that supports VNet integration when event-driven code must reach private endpoints. Now consider question number 119. We are moving to API integration. Review the situation. Consumer virtual machines and an AKS cluster share a virtual network. The API facade must expose one private IP, authenticate the AKS backend with mutual TLS, enforce request rate limits, and remain reachable only from the private network. Which option best meets the requirements? Option A, Azure Front Door with WAF. Option B, Application Gateway with WAF only. Option C, API Management Premium in internal virtual network mode. Option D, API Management Standard with only a service endpoint. In this case, select option C, API Management Premium in internal virtual network mode. Here is the technical justification. API Management Premium can run with private virtual network connectivity and provides policies for client certificate authentication, backend certificates, and rate limiting. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A, Front Door is an internet-facing global proxy and does not provide the required single private VNet IP. B, Application Gateway can provide private ingress and MTLS features, but does not offer the full API policy and quota capabilities requested as directly as API management. D, a service endpoint does not place the API management gateway behind one private IP or satisfy the complete private ingress design. Exam tip. Use API management for API authentication, quotas, and policies. Select a tier and network mode that satisfy private connectivity. Question number 120. Consider this scenario. A company must right-size 350 VMware virtual machines for Azure based on discovered CPU, memory, disk, and utilization data. The recommendation should require minimal manual calculation. Which service should produce the sizing assessment? Available choices. Choice A, Azure Cost Management. Choice B, Azure Advisor. Choice C, Azure Migrate. Choice D, Azure Pricing Calculator. The correct answer is option C, Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate discovers VMware workloads, collects performance data, assesses readiness, and recommends appropriately sized Azure virtual machines with cost estimates. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A, Cost Management analyzes spending after or during cloud use, not on-premises workload sizing. B, Advisor optimizes existing Azure resources and does not discover the VMware estate for migration assessment. D, the pricing calculator requires manually supplied sizes and usage assumptions. Use Azure Migrate Assessment for discovered workload right sizing. Use the pricing calculator for manual what-if estimates. The next item is question number 121. Review the situation. A manufacturer is consolidating many SQL Server databases that use CLR routines. Individual databases are below 4 terabytes, and the target must support Microsoft intra-authentication with minimal application changes. Which Azure data platform should the architect recommend? The options are: Choice A, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Choice B, Azure SQL Database Elastic Pools. Choice C, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Choice D, Azure SQL Database Single Databases. The appropriate choice is option C, Azure SQL Managed Instance. This is correct because Azure SQL Managed Instance provides near-full SQL Server compatibility, supports CLR integration and Microsoft intra-authentication, and removes most operating system and database engine maintenance. The remaining options are incorrect because A, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines preserves compatibility but requires substantially more operating system, patching, backup, and availability management. B, Elastic Pools share compute across Azure SQL databases but do not provide the instance-level compatibility needed for CLR-dependent migrations. D, Single Azure SQL databases require more compatibility remediation for instance-scoped SQL Server features. The key takeaway is choose SQL Managed Instance when near-instance compatibility and managed pass operations are both decisive. Question number 122. Next, we enter the topic of Application Gateway. Scenario: a retail portal runs on Azure Virtual Machines. The design must distribute HTTP requests at layer 7 and block common SouthQL injection attacks without changing application code. Map each architecture requirement to the Azure capability that satisfies it. The source items are as follows. Source item 1, layer 7 request distribution and URL-based routing. Source item 2, protection from SQL injection and other OWASP attacks. Match the source items to these destinations. Destination option A, Azure Web Application Firewall on Application Gateway. Destination option B, Azure Application Gateway. Destination option C, Azure Load Balancer. Map layer 7 request distribution and URL-based routing to Azure Application Gateway. Map protection from SQL injection and other OWASP attacks to Azure Web Application Firewall on Application Gateway. The key reason is Application Gateway is an HTTPS layer 7 load balancer with URL-based routing. Its Web Application Firewall capability applies managed OWASP protections, including SQL injection detection. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use Application Gateway for regional layer 7 routing and enable WAF when the same entry point must inspect web attacks. Proceed to question number 123. An enterprise has child Azure firewall policies stored in Central US, East US, and West Europe. A mandatory baseline must be inherited by every child policy. What is the minimum number of new parent policies required? Review the options. Option A, 1 parent policy. Option B, 2 parent policies. Option C, 3 parent policies. Option D, no additional policy. The required response is option C, 3 parent policies. The requirement is satisfied because a parent and its child Azure firewall policy must be stored in the same Azure region. 1 parent is therefore required in each of the 3 regions. A single parent cannot be inherited by child policies stored in 3 different regions. B, 2 parents leave 1 region without a same region parent. D, existing child policies do not provide a common inherited baseline by themselves. A useful examination rule is this. Azure firewall policy inheritance is regional even though a policy can be associated with a firewall in another region. Now consider question number 124. The focus now shifts to database scalability. Consider this scenario. A SaaS provider will host 20 small Azure SQL databases with different peak periods. The platform must provide a 99.99% availability commitment, allow the databases to share dynamically allocated compute, and support reserve capacity discounts. Which design minimizes compute cost? Option A, deploy every database in the serverless compute tier. Option B, place all databases in one Azure SQL Elastic Pool. Option C, run SQL Server on one standalone Azure virtual machine. Option D, run SQL Server on two virtual machines in an availability set. The best answer is option B. Place all databases in one Azure SQL Elastic Pool. The reasoning is as follows. An Elastic Pool lets databases with non-correlated usage share provision compute. Azure SQL reserve capacity can reduce predictable vCore costs while the managed service supplies the required availability. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Separate serverless databases scale independently but do not provide the same pooled reserve capacity cost model for this workload. C. A single VM does not meet the stated availability target and requires infrastructure management. D. An availability set protects against local hardware faults, not all service or regional failures, and still requires SQL Server administration. Keep this examination point in mind. Elastic pools are most effective when many databases have variable and non-simultaneous utilization. Proceed to question number 125. Scenario. A payment platform needs an OLTP database that can scale compute, use geo-redundant backup storage, and grow to approximately 75 terabytes. Complete the recommendation by selecting the database service and service tier. Statement 1. Use the blank as the managed relational database service. Choose between Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Azure Synapse Analytics. Statement 2. Use the blank service tier. Choose between business critical, general purpose, or hyperscale. The correct value for Statement 1 is Azure SQL Database. Azure SQL Database supplies the managed OLTP platform and required backup options. The correct value for Statement 2 is Hyperscale. Hyperscale provides the large, automatically growing storage architecture required by the workload. Exam tip. Use Hyperscale when database size and rapid storage growth exceed the practical limits of conventional Azure SQL tiers. Apply precise reasoning to question number 126. This one is marked hard. Eliminate the options systematically. Pay close attention to every stated constraint. An industrial telemetry platform receives about 50,000 timestamped device events per second. The platform must store the events and support near real-time queries and visualization. Which two Azure services can independently serve as the primary operational analytics store? Select 2. Select all answers that apply. Evaluate each option against the stated requirement. Next, option A, Azure Data Explorer. Next, option B, Azure Event Grid. Next, option C, Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Next, option D, Azure Table Storage. Select option A, Azure Data Explorer, and option C, Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Here is the technical justification. Azure Data Explorer is optimized for high-volume time series and telemetry analytics with near real-time KQL queries. Azure Cosmos DB can provide globally scalable low-latency ingestion and querying when the data model and partitioning strategy fit the workload. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because B, Event Grid routes discrete events, but is not a durable analytical database for this event volume. D, Table storage is a low-cost key-value store, but does not provide the same native near real-time analytical and visualization capabilities. Separate event ingestion from the analytical store. Choose Data Explorer for telemetry analytics and Cosmos DB for globally distributed operational access. Let us work through question number 127. Consider the following scenario. A SQL Server workload runs on one Azure virtual machine and receives a nightly batch update. The business requires regional recovery within 15 minutes, accepts up to 24 hours of data loss, requires orchestrated failover, and wants the lowest practical cost. Which disaster recovery technology should the architect recommend? Review each available choice. Choice A, Azure Site Recovery. Choice B, an always-on availability group. Choice C, Azure Disk Backup. Choice D, an availability set. In this case, select option A, Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery replicates the complete virtual machine to another region and provides orchestrated recovery. Its replication can satisfy an RPO far better than 24 hours without the database licensing and infrastructure cost of an always-on design. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B. Always-on can deliver very low RPO and RTO, but introduces additional SQL replicas, licensing, networking, and operational costs that the stated RPO does not justify. C. Disk backup provides recovery points, but does not deliver automated regional failover within the required RTO. D. An availability set protects against host and rack failures within one region and does not provide regional disaster recovery. The key takeaway is use site recovery for orchestrated VM-level regional disaster recovery. Use database native replication when stricter transactional RPO is decisive. Question number 128. This question moves us into messaging architecture. An order platform uses separate managed services for invoicing, payment, inventory, and delivery. The services must exchange XML business messages asynchronously with durable brokered delivery. Which Azure service should be used? The options are: Choice A, Azure Data Lake Storage. Choice B, Azure Service Bus. Choice C, Azure Traffic Manager. Choice D, Azure Service Fabric. The correct answer is option B, Azure Service Bus. This is correct because Azure Service Bus provides durable queues and topics for decoupled enterprise messaging and can carry XML payloads as message bodies. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Data Lake Storage is an analytical file store, not a brokered messaging service. C. Traffic Manager provides DNS-based endpoint routing and does not queue messages. D. Service Fabric is an application platform and does not replace an enterprise message broker. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use Service Bus for durable commands and business messages. Use Event Hubs for high-volume telemetry streams. The next item is question number 129. Review the situation. A research organization will deploy an elastic HPC environment in Azure while retaining a third-party batch scheduler. The operations team needs a service that provisions and manages cluster nodes. Which service should be recommended? Available choices. Choice A, Azure Automation. Choice B, Azure Lighthouse. Choice C, Azure Cycle Cloud. Choice D, Microsoft Purview. In this case, select option C, Azure Cycle Cloud. The key reason is Azure Cycle Cloud orchestrates the deployment, scaling, and management of HPC clusters and supports common third-party schedulers. The remaining options are incorrect because A. Azure Automation runs operational scripts, but is not an HPC cluster lifecycle manager. B. Azure Lighthouse enables cross-tenant resource management. D. Microsoft Purview provides data governance and cataloging. A useful examination rule is this. Cycle Cloud is the Azure service for scheduler-integrated HPC cluster provisioning and elasticity. Evaluate question number 130. Against every requirement. This question moves us into global routing. Analyze the scenario before evaluating the choices. A web application is deployed in North Europe and West Europe. North Europe must receive all normal traffic. West Europe must take over after a regional failure, and routing costs should be minimized. Complete the global routing design. The first statement reads, use the blank as the global endpoint service. Choose between Azure Traffic Manager, Azure Application Gateway, or Azure Load Balancer. The second statement reads, configure the blank routing. Choose between priority traffic routing, performance traffic routing, or weighted traffic routing. Statement 1 should be completed with Azure Traffic Manager. Traffic Manager supplies inexpensive global endpoint health monitoring and DNS failover. Statement 2 should be completed with priority traffic routing. Priority routing implements the required active-passive regional behavior. Keep this examination point in mind. Use Traffic Manager priority routing for DNS-based active-passive failover. Use front door when layer 7 proxying and acceleration are required. Now consider question number 131. Consider this scenario. A storage operations team has a PowerShell cleanup script. Every hour, the platform must detect duplicate objects, email an approval request, process the manager's response, and run the script only after approval. Which serverless architecture should be recommended? Review the options. Option A, Azure Functions with Azure Batch. Option B, Azure Logic Apps with Azure Functions. Option C, Azure Logic Apps with Event Grid only. Option D, Azure Pipelines with Service Fabric. The appropriate choice is Option B, Azure Logic Apps with Azure Functions. The requirement is satisfied because Logic Apps provides the scheduled workflow, email connectors, approval handling, and branching. An Azure function can execute the PowerShell cleanup logic on demand. A. Batch is intended for large-scale parallel jobs and does not provide the approval workflow. C. Event Grid can route events, but does not by itself execute the PowerShell cleanup or manage human approval. D. Azure Pipelines and Service Fabric add unnecessary application platform and DevOps complexity. Exam tip. Combine Logic Apps for workflow orchestration with functions for custom serverless code. Proceed to question number 132. Review the situation. 4 storage accounts exist: a standard general-purpose V2 account, a premium general-purpose V2 account, a standard blob storage account, and a premium file storage account. One app needs blob lifecycle tiering. Another needs an SMB file share. Select the eligible accounts for each workload. Review each blank and choose the most appropriate option. For the first statement, for blob lifecycle tiering, use the blank. Select from the standard general-purpose V2 and standard blob storage accounts, all general-purpose V2 and blob storage accounts, or only the premium general-purpose V2 account. For the second statement, for an Azure file share, use the blank. Select from the standard general-purpose V2 and premium file storage accounts, all 4 accounts, or only the premium file storage account. The answer to the first statement is the standard general-purpose V2 and standard blob storage accounts. The standard GPV2 and blob storage account types satisfy the lifecycle policy requirement represented by the source scenario. The answer to the second statement is the standard general-purpose V2 and premium file storage accounts. Standard GPV2 supports standard file shares, while file storage is the dedicated premium file share account type. Evaluate both account kind and performance tier. A storage account's label alone does not prove that every storage service is supported. Now consider question number 133. Next, we enter the topic of hybrid identity. Background. A European engineering company has separate production and research ADDS forests with no trust. Production workloads will move to Azure, while the research forest must remain entirely on-premises. Current environment. Production users authenticate with the corp.example.com forest. Azure virtual machines will continue to depend on that forest for domain authentication. Business requirements. Production authentication must continue if the link between Azure and the on-premises data center fails. Technical requirements. The research forest must not be extended to Azure. Management overhead should be minimized while maintaining authentication resilience. Which identity architecture should be included? Review the options. Choice A, move every production domain controller to Azure. Choice B, deploy additional production forest domain controllers in Azure Virtual Networks. Choice C, deploy research forest domain controllers in Azure. Choice D, create a separate Microsoft intratenant for each production workload. The required response is Option B, deploy additional production forest domain controllers in Azure Virtual Networks. The reasoning is as follows. Adding production forest domain controllers in Azure allows Azure-hosted workloads to authenticate during a WAN outage while retaining on-premises domain controllers for local resilience. The alternatives can be eliminated because A, moving every domain controller to Azure would make on-premises authentication dependent on connectivity to Azure. C, extending the research forest violates the requirement that research operations remain on-premises. D, additional intratenants do not provide ADDS authentication for the migrated virtual machines. The key takeaway is place domain controllers near dependent workloads when ADDS authentication must survive a site-to-cloud link failure. Review question number 134. Carefully. Let us first review the situation. A Logic Apps workflow must write to an on-premises SQL server. The database server has no direct internet access and no VPN exists. A separate gateway host can make outbound HTTPS connections to Azure. Complete the connectivity design. Review Statement 1. Install the blank in the on-premises network. The options for this statement are an on-premises data gateway, an application proxy connector, or hybrid connection manager. Review Statement 2. Create the blank in Azure and associate it with the workflow connection. The options for this statement are an on-premises data gateway resource, an application gateway, or an enterprise application. For Statement 1, select an on-premises data gateway. The gateway software provides the secure outbound bridge to the local data source. For Statement 2, select an on-premises data gateway resource. The Azure resource registers and exposes that gateway to supported Logic Apps connectors. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use the on-premises data gateway for supported connectors when private data sources must be reached through outbound-only connectivity. Question number 135. Consider this scenario. A transactional Azure SQL workload requires synchronous replica failover with no committed data loss and zone-level availability. The design should use the lowest cost listed database option that meets both requirements. Which deployment should be selected? The options are: Option A, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. Option B, Azure SQL Database Basic. Option C, Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical. Option D, Azure SQL Database Premium with Zone Redundancy. The best answer is Option D, Azure SQL Database Premium with Zone Redundancy. Here is the technical justification. Azure SQL Database Premium supports local high-availability replicas and can be configured for zone redundancy. It meets the database requirement without the additional instance-level scope and cost of Managed Instance Business Critical. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A, general-purpose managed instance does not provide the same local synchronous replica architecture required by the scenario. B, Basic does not provide the required zone-resilient high-availability architecture. C, Managed Instance Business Critical can meet high-availability requirements but adds instance compatibility and costs that are not required. A useful examination rule is this. Select the least costly tier that explicitly supports zone redundancy and synchronous high availability for the required service model. The next item is question number 136. We are moving to storage cost design. Scenario. An organization must archive 5 terabytes of rarely accessed files in Azure. Retrieval within 24 hours is acceptable, and storage cost must be minimized. Which 2 configurations meet the requirement? Select 2. Choose every option that satisfies the requirement. Choice A. Use a GPv2 account, upload to a blob container, and move each blob to archive. Choice B. Use a premium file storage account and place the files in an SMB share. Choice C. Use a blob storage account and set each uploaded blob to archive. Choice D. Use a general-purpose V1 account and retain the blobs in the default tier. Choice E. Use a GPv2 account and copy the files to an Azure file share. The required selections are Option A. Use a GPv2 account, upload to a blob container, and move each blob to archive, and Option C. Use a blob storage account and set each uploaded blob to archive. Both GPv2 blob containers and blob storage accounts support the Archive access tier. Archive provides the lowest online Azure blob storage cost and typically requires hours for rehydration, fitting the 24-hour availability window. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B. Premium files are optimized for low latency and carry much higher storage cost. D. General-purpose V1 does not provide blob access tiers such as Archive. E. Azure file shares do not provide the Archive blob tier. Keep this examination point in mind. Archive tier is for data that tolerates rehydration delay. Access tiers apply to blobs, not Azure file shares. Question number 137. A fulfillment platform decomposes order processing into billing, stock, payment, and shipping services. The services must exchange durable XML messages asynchronously. Which service should the architect select? Available choices. Option A, Azure Blob Storage. Option B, Azure Notification Hubs. Option C, Azure Service Bus. Option D, Azure Data Lake Storage. The correct answer is option C, Azure Service Bus. This is correct because Azure Service Bus supplies durable enterprise queues and topics with brokered asynchronous delivery and supports XML payloads. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Blob storage stores objects but does not provide message broker semantics. B. Notification Hubs targets mobile push notifications. D. Data Lake Storage is designed for analytical files rather than transactional messaging. Exam tip. Service Bus is the default choice for durable business messaging that requires queues, topics, retries, or dead lettering. You have completed part 3 of the AZ-305 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.